Hi there, I'm Des.
And I'm Tim, and together Des and I head up the men's ministry Momentum Australia.
Momentum has multiple functions, but primarily our aim is to help men to succeed in life, to do life better.
We run a weekly radio show that goes all around Australia where we talk about anything and everything that relates to men.
And we encourage men to do life in community, to do life with other men where we can be accountable, we can be welcome, we can be open and honest about what's happening in our world.
We'd love you to have a look around our website. That's momentumaustralia.org. There you'll find a bunch of resources to help you on your journey and all of our previous episodes and topics.
We thank you for your interest in Momentum Australia, and we hope you enjoyed this video today.
Well, welcome to this week's Momentum. It is fantastic to have you tuning in wherever you are around Australia right now. Thanks so much for doing that. We exist for you. We are by men for men, and to help you just do life that little bit better. If you'd like some help in that, check out our website, momentumaustralia.org. We've got a bunch of stuff on there that will help you in your journey. And of course, you can hear previous episodes of the show. And if you feel like supporting us financially, that would be fantastic too, momentumaustralia.org. As always, Des, my co-host and good friend, joins me this week. How are you this week, Des? You traveling well?
Yeah, really good. Really, really good. Yeah, it's great to be alive in such a time as this. And so I just want to remind the men about our care line. Momentum Care Line's 1-800-000-MEN. That's 636, and that's available 7 days a week, 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. And it's all about if you're on your own and you have nobody to reach out to, another man to reach out to that you can confide in. On the care line, there's people who are ready and willing to talk to you about whatever issues you're dealing with confidentially. And so it's a really good space to go to, 1-800-000-MEN.
Yeah. Earlier in the year, and you can check this out at momentumaustralia.org, we spoke to Paul Bedwell from Youth for Christ. Paul is heading up the What's Normal program, which is a 10-week video program that teaches school students about the dangers of pornography and encourages them to kind of challenge what is considered normal in today's porn culture.
It's the key question, isn't it? What's normal? The program creates a safe and judgment-free space to open dialogue and help youth think critically about the effects our supposed normal culture is having on them and others. And while it's fantastic that kids have this option at schools, the bigger question is, as parents, how do we actually have the sort of conversations with our kids that we need to have?
Absolutely. A recent article by Danny Huerta expressed 7 things that we can do as parents to help our teens combat porn use. The article was recently featured on the Focus on the Family Australia website. That's families.org.au. And joining us this week to talk this through is the CEO of Focus on the Family Australia, good friend of ours too. He's been on the show a few times. Brett Ryan, welcome back to Momentum, Brett. Great to have you, man.
It's a pleasure being with you, gentlemen.
That's cool.
Pornography is pervasive. We've talked about that, and we certainly have talked on the show about how that can affect men's lives in such a dramatic way. And often that starts at a young age. And so, rather than, I suppose, the cure at the end of it, let's look at the prevention, particularly for our kids. And I mean, it is so accessible. We talk about that all the time now, phones and laptops and iPads and everything. It's just a couple of clicks away. Some things here that we can do to help our kids combat their potential temptations, shall we say. But I suppose let's start off by saying, Brett, from your perspective, because as parents, this is tricky, right? I mean, this is a space that is uncomfortable for everybody to sit in and talk about. Do you have some thoughts around how we could even perhaps start having these conversations with our kids?
Yeah, great question. I think it is starting earlier than we ever anticipated. We have to get out of our comfort zones and have these conversations, these brave and much needed conversations. I actually spoke at a school last night on how to talk to your kids about sex. That's basically what I was speaking about. And they were asking some great questions about how to navigate this. And there'll be some people who like to keep their head in the sand and pretend it won't happen. It won't happen to me. My kids will never do that. My kids, and for those who've got a faith, they're a Christian and they won't do this type of thing. But all the research would say, and I think we spoke about this last time about for men, we're seeing about 58 to 60% of Christian men are looking at pornography on a semi-regular basis. That's in the church. And then we're seeing about 30 to 33% of women are looking at pornography. And so we think that maybe, old adults, but we're also seeing young people, younger and younger. I've got a friend of mine who's a child psychologist, and he's dealing with 8-year-olds with pornography.
Oh my gosh.
And, so how does that happen? What was happening with the parents not being as vigilant? But it is one click away. And if you're not supervising your children, and we know we can put some external filters, but we have to help our young people have internal filters when it comes to looking at appropriate imagery.
Yeah, it's true. And, one of the things that we realized is that, children as young as 3 3 and 4 lifting up their father's phone, it's unlocked. And if the father's been watching pornography, there's images going into a 3-year-old's mind that will never, ever disappear. And it adjusts their whole view on women and marriage and so forth. It's a really serious issue.
I should add that it's not just guys that have this issue.
Oh, that's right.
In fact, I just recently had a plane ride up to Emerald in Queensland. So hello to people who may be listening to an Emerald around that area. And I was speaking to a guy on the plane next to me, and he found out what I did for a living. He was fascinated what I spoke about. And he said he had a mate of his that his wife was looking at their history on their computer and found all this pornography. And so he was in the firing line, and he says, look, it's not me. And they couldn't even fathom who was looking at this type of information. And it turned out it was their 11-year-old daughter.
Wow.
And how they had to navigate that and help her realize that what she was doing, is not only not helping her being the best version of herself now, but it's not setting her up for success later on.
Yeah.
And it's not just a guy issue, it's also a girl issue. And in fact, about 30% of habitual viewers of pornography seeking professional help are now women. So it's pervasive in our culture. And we, as for the dads listening to this, we need to be much more proactive rather than reactive, and start having the conversations about their body and the changes that are going to happen, the physiological changes, the emotional, the psychological, the relational changes, but also talking about guarding themselves, because technology and sex go hand in hand. Gone are the days of looking at a magazine. It's now at a click of a button on smartphones, tablets, desktops, and laptops. And so we as parents need to be quite vigilant, but we also need to teach our kids to be vigilant at the same time.
Just one question on that, Brett. I mean, there's going to be plenty of dads who are listening to this show who really have no idea how to start having those conversations because they find them embarrassing. They would shy away from them because they're embarrassed. What advice would you give to those fathers who are struggling with that?
Well, I think it starts with setting up themselves for success, being informed, reading, getting as much information about different ways of doing that, the strategies, because one works for one person may not work for another person. So being more competent in knowledge will give you more confidence. And when you're more confident, it will come across with, you may be on the inside freaking out, but on the outside, cool, calm, and collected. Someone actually asked me this question just recently about, how do you have that conversation? How do you start? Do you wait for the kid to come up to you, or do you go and speak to the kid? And I said, yes and no, because every child is different. Some of them, I remember talking to my boys, and one of my sons, I said, well, so how much detail do you want? And he goes, a little bit, what's way to the conversation. So we need to actually maybe set the tone up. And I can give a lot of details. Being a former nurse, I can go into great details. I thought it was quite funny. My wife said, if we had girls, you would have been talking about menstruation.
Yes.
Why is that? And he goes, well, you're the nurse. And I said, well, you're a woman. You have it. She goes, I can have it, but I don't want to talk about it. But I say that in jest. The fact is that we have to get out of our comfort zone, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when our children will be exposed to that. That's and how we approach it in a very, and I think a key phrase, and I think I've spoken about this in the past, learn to respond, not react. Because when we react, we shut the conversation up. But when we respond, we're watching our tone, our volume, the way that we go about it. But, our children will go at the level of their maturity and understanding. But at the same time, we need to be push the envelope a little bit, because they need to be prepared. As I said, because it will come and hunt them down. It's so pervasive in our culture today. Things that were considered to be porn a number of years ago, are now seen in mainstream. And so we've seen that dilution of what is acceptable in our culture today. And that's the reason why mums and dads, and particularly dads, need to be setting the tone of how you can talk to your kids, both your boys and your girls, about the dangers that lurk right around the corner.
Yeah. Brett, this is perhaps a controversial question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think that some dads shy away from the conversation because they're ashamed that they are themselves watching pornography?
Yeah, no one likes to be a hypocrite, and children will smell a hypocrite a mile away, especially as Des was sharing, that kids, if they find an open phone and they look and they're saying, Dad, you're telling me not to look at pornography? Why are you talking about that? So no one wants to be a hypocrite. And so I think we as adults need to set the tone that if you have got this issue, and I know we've spoken about this before, if you have an issue, you need to find accountability people. You need to start discerning what you allow your mind and heart and spirit and eyes are looking and consuming, because it's not doing you any good now, and it won't do you any good in the future. There's nothing that can justify this virtual world, and it's dehumanizing women, and it's actually, you know, violent and degrading, and in some certain circumstances dealing with child trafficking and sex trafficking. So it's not, as, you know, like people say, well, they're empowered and they can justify it all they like, and no one's going to get pregnant, and I can't get an STD, and I deserve it, and they can justify it. But it is polluting our minds, and it's actually dissatisfying the reality that we live in by living in a virtual reality. And that's the reason why, as dads, we need to start speaking to our kids, role model it ourselves, have it in our own spirit of purity and righteousness. And then we can actually, you know, put it upon our children to say, hey, I had this issue. And maybe you have to share your own journey, you know, to say, I had this issue and I don't want that to happen to you.
Brett, is there an age? Obviously, it's getting younger, and it's going to differ from child to some degree, right? But let's be honest, the schools still do their bit, and that was my sex education. But aside from that, my parents, we didn't talk about that, and this was back in the 80s. So, you know, we didn't have access to this stuff. Kids, obviously, they've got phones and they're going to show it to their friends. So there's going to be an increasingly young age that kids are going to be exposed to this stuff. But let's assume that parents listening right now, if they've got a younger child, like, how young is too young? But then we don't want to leave it too late either, because if they don't hear it from us first, they're going to hear it in the playground or at school or something. So I know that's a tricky question to answer, but there's some guidelines around what sort of age we should start to think about having that conversation.
It's not a tricky question, because it's a simple answer. As early as their maturity dictates. So even a 4-year-old who understands their body and the importance of protecting their body, you can start talking about it. Now, you don't go into great detail of everything. You just go at a level, and it's an ongoing dialogue. So you're encouraging questions, and you want your children to actually be inquisitive and curious. And remember, no, don't react. You know, just respond and don't freak out. I often joke about the story of a little boy came up to him about 7 or 8 years of age, and he said, "Daddy, where did I come from?" And the dad goes, "Oh man, I didn't think I'd have to tell you this story." Anyway, proceeded to tell the whole story, and the kid's looking at, okay. And then at the end of this great long monologue, he says, do you want to know any more? And he goes, "No." He goes, "Why did you ask?" And he says, "Well, Tom says he comes from Sydney, and my mate comes from, Wollongong. I just want to know where I come from." So it's good to clarify a question with a question, just to know that you're going at the level. But as I was saying before, the importance of allowing a space that your children can come and ask you some questions, and without fear of retribution or reaction. And it sets the tone. So even 4-year-olds can understand about their body and protecting their body, and then progressing up along the way, ongoing little bits along the way, rather than download everything all at once.
Sure.
And it may be because you were saying that, because of their own journey and own experience, you learned in school. If I ask that question to an audience of 100 people, how many of you think you should speak to your children about sex? And you get about 100% of people put their hands up. How many of you are actually talking to your kids about sex? And you might get about 5 to 10%. So the knowing doing gap. But we shouldn't abdicate our responsibility as parents to talk about this. And we have to get out of our comfort zone and start talking to them. And in fact, we've got a book on our website called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures. And there's one for junior and one for senior. The junior one is from about 4 to 7-year-olds, and it's talking about pornography in an age appropriate now. And then there's the other older one, which is from about 8 to 12-year-olds. So there's some things, and I've actually done an interview with a pastor by the name of Joel Chalaya, and he's written a book called The Chat. And that's another how to talk to your kids about this. A great animation, and we've done a podcast on that. And there's just different ways and strategies. So the better information you have, more confident you are, more competent you're going to be, and you can actually start talking to your kids. So it's not about, there's no age too young. You don't want to talk about a 2-year-old, but you can start talking about a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and progress away.
That's good.
There's a couple of things there you talked about that I just want to re-emphasize, and one of them is the relationship you have with your child. And so that has to be one of openness, it has to be one of honesty and truthfulness.
Yeah.
And if you have those, then you've got the basis to have those conversations. If you don't have those, you're fighting backwards.
Yeah, and relationship is the key in everything.
Yeah.
Like if you want to position yourself that your kids do feel comfortable and not threatened, that you're going to react, and that's all comes through relationship. And that is going to be the challenge that you have, that starting earlier and earlier is going to set you up for great success. To set your children up so that they feel comfortable that, Dad, he's pretty good. He's going to discipline me from time to time. I get that. He loves me, but at the same time, we can have some fun together, and we can also talk about seriously. And I tell you what, the best thing you can do with your kids is have conversations with them when they're doing something, whether it's playing a game, shooting some hoops, driving in the car, rather than look at me, look at me, look at me. Just actually have these discussions and make it matter of fact. And you don't have to talk about it for the whole time, just little bits along the way.
Let's then look at these 7 strategies as we move forward into the latter part of this show. And the first is teach your teen how to manage stress, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose when you look at some of the reasons why we as men and people go to pornography, it is stress relief.
Yeah, and they use that as an excuse and justify their behaviors by saying, hey, I earn it, I deserve it, I'm under the pump at the moment. And so we need to help our children be able to be self-regulating. And when they're stressed or anxious or, angry or frustrated, whatever their emotions are, we need to help them be able to navigate that in a much healthier way and not turn to pornography is one thing, but also other, behaviors that aren't life enhancing. And we are obviously talking about pornography today, but if they have some strategies to be able to manage their emotions and managing their stress by doing things that are healthy, like, for example, I'll use this as an example. I actually interviewed a gentleman who was addicted to pornography. This is an adult now. He started his own ministry in this area. And he uses, whenever he gets that temptation, because as an addict, he's always going to be an addict. He's either going to be practicing or non-practicing. And so anytime he gets the feelings, he actually exercises. He actually does something in a very healthy way. And so he chose cycling. So no matter what time of the day he would be cycling. And so I would be encouraging young or parents to talk to their kids about finding different ways about, either exercising is one way to stimulate themselves, to be outward focused rather than inward focused. Different ways of managing your stress will help them be able to be confident to be able to say no when they're tempted.
And of course, that will only work if you're actually practicing it yourself.
Yes.
So
back to being role models.
Yeah, exactly. And that's so key in this conversation for men who are listening, or even mothers who are listening. We must be the role models for our kids because they learn from us.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
As far as exercise, that's good. But let's say we've got kids who don't like exercise, they don't like going outdoors. What are some things they could do indoors that might help take that pressure off, the stress off, the release? What sorts of other things could you suggest for perhaps more inactive kids, should we say?
Yeah, and maybe that they can, they might be musically inclined or creative. They can actually use art or, learning to play an instrument. Maybe, believe it or not, books still exist. So they might be able to read books with pages. The different things that, obviously every child's unique. And so you have to find out what drives them, what motivates them, what's their language of love, what fills their tank, and tap into that. And I actually also recommend to help, maybe I know it seems contrary, but gaming is another way of managing stress. So I would encourage dads to, even though it may not be on your wheelhouse, get your kids to teach you about gaming. You're entering into their world and they've got something common denominator. You're earning the right to speak into their lives because you're entering into their life. And then you'd be surprised how many great conversations can happen when you're both looking at the screen and shooting down things and you can and something might come up and you can actually start talking about stuff.
Yeah, and I remember when I was a kid, the family used to all sit around the table and play Monopoly and Cluedo and all those sort of, in front of the fireplace and stuff. And it's amazing the amount of conversations come up when you start to play games like that.
Yes,
it's amazing. So I'd encourage dads who don't do board games or whatever it is with their kids to get up there and actually do it and build a relationship that way. It's a really cool way to do it.
I do recommend board games, by the way.
Yeah.
You don't have to turn to technology, which leads us to number two. You need to start putting some limitations on technology.
Yeah.
Role model, because it's all very well for you to say, get off your phone, and then you're on your phone yourself, and it sends a mixed message. Early you do that and not allow technology to become their go-to babysitter, their stress reliever. They just do it and they think it's their God-given right to be on technology all the time. But remind them that it's a privilege and you have to use this privilege wisely. So I'd be putting in some technology boundaries, but don't just make decisions for the sake of it, because you can. You're the boss, you're the adult, but include them in the decision. What do you think is reasonable? But do that earlier rather than later, because once the horse is bolted, it's very, very hard to take it.
That's great advice. Yeah.
What about putting, some software on there, some filtering stuff as well, Brett? Do you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, there's a number of different. I mean, when our boys were younger, I came across a thing called K9, and that was a fantastic little filter, but it blocked everything. You couldn't.
Right.
It was brutal. You've got to do study for different things because you couldn't find anything, especially in my line of work.
Right.
And there's Net Nanny and there's Force Field. Covenant Eyes has got some great things. I think you've still got to try and do your appropriate research. There's a lot of different things. Rather than me recommending a particular product, many of the internet providers have their own filters, but we just don't know how to tap into it. So I'll contact their information line and ask them, how do I put these things in place? Because they've got those facilities available to you. We just don't know how to utilize them. But as I think I said earlier, it's all very well to have external filters, but you need to have our children to have internal filters to be more discerning. Because all of my boys were exposed to pornography when someone brought a not so smartphone to school.
Yeah.
And that gave them the opportunity to look at things. And so unless they have that internal filter, you can create all the wonderful things around your household, but they have to be able to act and live in the real world.
And also there's the whole element of being trusted and being trustworthy and being accountable, even as young kids. It's important that they understand what the boundaries are. And, sometimes in society, that's not acceptable use of language, but it's real. And so, we'd be able to set those boundaries.
Yeah. And part of that another part would be, putting some restrictions on the amount of technology they consume and putting some filters. But we also have, where do they consume this technology? And I would encourage to have an open door policy, that they can't have it in their privacy of their own rooms. They have to do it in a public space, whether it's the family room or the kitchen, wherever it may be. If you allow them to look at the devices by themselves without any supervision, you're just asking for trouble.
That's number 3, create an open device policy, which is interesting. I mean, what about this thought of routinely going through our kids' phones? Like, some parents would think that that's a good thing to do. Like, once a month, we just randomly grab the phone and go, no, it's time for that checkup. What do you think about that? Is that too invasive? Is that overstepping?
Yes and no, depending on the age their child is. When they're much younger, be a little bit more vigilant. But as they're getting a bit older, I mean, I would say that, for kids, when I talk to if I'm speaking at a student presentation, I say, allow your mum and dad to be your Facebook friend. And they go, no way, I never want to do that. and I say to them, why is that the case? Oh, they'll look what I'm doing. They'll look at what I'm, consuming. I said, well, isn't that the important thing? If you're hiding something, shouldn't you be, if you're hiding something from your mum and dad, that's a concern. But I would also say to mum and dad, you can be their friend, but don't be their big brother or big sister. You need to be aware of what's going on and be safe for them. But it's a matter of that balance between prying into them, their world, their privacy, but also discerning if it's good and healthy for them. And so I think it's a fine line. But I also encourage you, you could say to your kids, every now and then, not all the time, but every now and then, I might just probe in to have a look at your history. So then your kids will know that mum and dad will look at it. But then you'll also be aware that kids are pretty smart and they know how to hide different things. So
certainly smarter than we are, probably.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Number 4 comes back to what we were talking about before, Brett, and I actually really love that, because that's true, right? I mean, as much as we want the external things in place, ideally, we'd love our kids to have the right heart, mind, attitude, spirit towards this stuff, so that we're not having to police them, in inverted commas. So number 4 really ties into that. Teach the difference between wants and needs in our kids. I mean, that's a really good message.
Yeah, I mean, the trouble is kids think they need technology to live. It's like their oxygen supply is cut off if they don't have access to technology. I could say that for adults as well. But, you know, we need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need clothing, and we need to ideally have a relationship with God. That's what we need.
Yeah.
We all need that as the best thing we can have. But one of the things that a lot of people justify, and I've heard this time and time, I need sex. I need to be released. I need, and that's not, you will not die without sex. You will not die. You won't explode if you don't have that stimulation. But people have distorted that and say, I need it. It's rather than a want. And so if we can start teaching our kids the discernment of what is a real need, what is a have to have, as opposed to a want. And so a key phrase is delayed gratification, and knowing that our children need to learn those skills because they like everything, the biggest, the shiniest, the best, the most expensive. They want it all now. And they think that that's the status. But we need to encourage them to have that delayed gratification. You can't have everything at when you say it, because that's not life. That's not reality. And so you can delay that. And that's the same thing with sexual purity. You know, the reason why God has sent his son to die upon a cross for us is to live life and life to its full. That's what Jesus came. And a lot of people associate the Bible and God by association with saying that God is always a party pooper. He wants to spoil my fun. He doesn't want me to have a great time. In fact, that's the opposite. Yeah. God's actually saying, hey, here are some boundaries, and I want you to stay and live your life to its full. If you stay within these boundaries, life can be awesome. But if you step outside the boundaries, there'll be consequences.
Yes, that's a
so
good
we have
word.
to teach our kids the importance of staying within the boundaries because it's good for them now and into the future.
Yeah, it's great.
Really good. Number 5 is essentially what we talked about in the beginning of the show, and that was talk about sex, oxytocin, the mindset, that sort of thing. And of course, if we want to do that well, we have to understand that ourselves. So that goes back to the first one that you were talking about, get informed ourselves and then be on the front foot and having those conversations. Number 6, which I think is really interesting, help your team particularly cultivate wise risk-taking and decision-making. So what would you, I mean, how do we banner wise risk-taking decision-making?
Well, I will point out that in this day and age, kids are risk-averse. They're increasingly risk-averse. They're not trying new things because they fear of failure. They feel that someone will video them and put it on social media. They want to be 100% and perfect straight away. And that's that drive that actually makes them feel like, if I don't succeed, I won't try at all. But we want to encourage our kids to fail and fail forward. Making mistakes is okay. When we want to have a child, they need to have this process. And part of you, I mean, going back to that one, number 5 about oxytocin and the mindset, your job as parents is to be their prefrontal cortex, to actually start thinking, because their front of their brains is still developing. And you need to actually ask them the question, you know, have you considered, what are your thoughts about this? You're their prefrontal cortex, because they're really, honestly, not thinking. And especially when they don't see the consequences of looking at pornography, they're not thinking of the bigger picture. And so that's your job, is to remind them of that. And the same thing when it comes to how allow them their decision-making process. Have you considered, what do you think is the worst case scenario? And what about what's the best, the pro and con list? Allow them to start filtering. And rather than you telling them what to do, it's better to come to their own conclusion, and they will actually have their own moment, light bulb moment. The more likely they're going to follow it through and own it.
That's so good. That's great advice. I love that.
Very good.
That's really good.
And the final one, encourage a close and authentic relationship with God, you and others. And essentially that's what you were saying before. I mean, obviously, as a parent particularly, we want to have an open door policy with our kids and feel like we are safe spaces for them to come to, but also authentic relationship with our Lord. And of course, again, that places the emphasis on us to model that to our kids, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. The influence, and that could be for another podcast, another time, about the importance of fathers and how that significantly influences the genuine faith, and an outward expression of that for a father has a flow-on effect to children. Far greater, not to underestimate women in any shape or form or the importance of mothers, but when dad takes God seriously and takes his church seriously, the kids will stand up and take notice. There are no guarantees. There are no guarantees, but your close relationship that you have with the children will help in certain degree, but your close relationship with the Heavenly Father will be able to think that they will grab onto. And we're always on show. We're always going to be role modeling. And so how you love their mother how you love their grandmother, all these things. They're watching and observing about how you treat other people. But then most importantly, what's driving you? What's your value point? And the value point is that God is the center of me, in my relationship, and I want to be able to have an outward expression. So loving God vertically will help me love others horizontally.
It's been a great discussion based on an article called 7 Strategies to Combat Teen Porn Use. You can find this on the Focus on the Families Australia website, families.org.au. And our special guest this week has been the CEO of Focus on the Family Australia, Brett Ryan. Brett, so much in this week's show. Really appreciate what you've just sown into our lives as well. We've learned some stuff today, but into men and families all around Australia, mate. We really appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
You're more than welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this week's show, and we hope you subscribe to Momentum so you can find out what's happening in the shows in the future.
Absolutely. And keep an eye on our website too. That's momentumaustralia.org. There you'll find all of our shows and a whole heap of resources to help you on your journey. That is momentumaustralia.org.
Until next time, keep moving forward
with Momentum.